The Center for Healthy Sex Expert Lecture Series for Professionals proudly presents Christopher Mulligan, who is speaking on The Teenager's Guide to the Safe Use of Internet Pornography.
This presentation is an interesting one to me, which is that the audience that this particular PowerPoint for is actually for teens. So the idea behind this particular presentation and this PowerPoint was, what should we say to teenagers about internet pornography, about cyber porn? Because what they are being exposed to, what they have access to, is so completely different than any other generation of teens ever. And so the question is, for a lot of parents and mental health professionals and teachers, is porn the new normal on the internet? You know, is it just to be expected that it just would be part of their discovery process and understanding the internet and understanding sexuality now through pornography? And people are behind the curve on this. The kids are way out in front in terms of exploring their sexuality using the internet. And sex education, which is still dealing with issues like sexually transmitted disease, which is important, and pregnancy, which is important, and normative sexual behavior, which is important, and atypical. Some programs get into more atypical behaviors, but by and large, the cyber porn topic is not covered in adolescent or pre-adolescent forms of sex education. So there's a real gap in. So I just on this slide, I won't read the whole thing. I just say that this slide is saying is that sex education usually covers what we expect it to cover, but it doesn't cover cyber porn. And what kids have access to is so extraordinarily different, because they can get into fetish porn with a click of their mouse or and before they know it, they're deeply, involved in very, very powerful forms of sexual stimulation, with literally just a simple one click or one search, and they're off and running and into areas of sexuality that we never dreamed that they would have any access to, much less access to all the time if they wanted it. So how much porn is there? This is part of the presentation. Those of you that have read, this is one of the best books, and I also interviewed Wendy Maltz, who did The Porn Trap. This is a terrific book and was very influential in the way that I began to conceptualize what to say to teenagers. Because in my interview with her, I asked her, what would she say to teens? Because the audience for The Porn Trap is an adult audience, not a teen audience. So 400 million pages. This was several years ago, so it's well above that number at this point. And then the gross revenues at over 320 billion. Again, that number is probably low at this point. So try to appeal to teens' sense of proportion by talking about just how much porn there really is out there and what a revenue producer it is as well. So it's bigger as a business, if you're talking to teens, than professional football, baseball, and basketball combined, for just as an example. I mean, that's the kind of revenue producer it is. And then, that statistic comes from Pat Carnes, that particular one, the 320 billion annually. So I begin the talk to the teens with what amount and what type of pornography is appropriate or safe, because that's really the question that parents have and teens have it themselves. How much porn can I watch, and what's a safe amount, and what kind of porn would that be? so the other way to formulate the question is there websites that are educational and provide good information or good content that are sexually explicit in their presentation? So, so the reality is that both teens and adults, use the internet to look up and get good content about human sexuality, including sexually transmitted diseases, purchasing and reviewing options for contraception, which is important to teens, obviously, and in exploring their sexuality. Cyberspace, as we call it, allows teens and adults to explore their sexual fantasies and explore sexual preferences and learn about different forms of sexual expression in a safe and secure home environment. So that's the good news, right? Is that it could be used to explore their sexuality, or to explore contraception, or to explore STDs, and that's one possibility. The problem is, and these numbers are hard to nail down because there's so little research done on teens and porn, because it would be very difficult, as you can imagine, to get parents to sign up to a study that would be for teens and porn, for the obvious reason that it would be illegal. And so it's guesstimates about sort of where, based on video game addiction, which parents are willing to engage in studies. So somewhere between 5% of teens and maybe as high as 15 struggle to control their behavior and experience devastating and long-lasting consequences. And some teens collect and view porn, others cross legal boundaries. One of the other things that I do is I write what are called mitigation reports or social histories in sex offense cases, usually involving a younger population, not a paraphilic population, but a population from 17 to 21 that have sort of wandered into child pornography, that started out with vanilla porn and started out by looking at pure porn and then kind of worked their way back chronologically. And then LAPD or the sheriff or Homeland Security or Interpol or whatever agency is monitoring, some of them are international sites, track back and then arrest the kids and charge them as adults. So it's the predator concerns are real, but the other concern that's actually more significant and statistically is these kids wandering into child porn sites and then getting arrested as adults. And
that happens pretty quickly.
Yes.
And
that's right. And then they click a few more times and a few more times, and then they also do this thing called torrenting. And so torrenting is a method of piracy where they're pirating huge amounts of content, some of which is child pornography, regular pornography. Sometimes they know they're doing it, sometimes they don't know that they're doing it. But I had a case that was in Oregon, a student at Oregon State, and I thought, a really good report for him, but they just weren't buying it, that it was not something that he had intended to do, to collect this porn. But because he was torrenting, he had a lot of it on his computer. So law enforcement just said he has a lot of it, he must be a collector. And so the worst outcome of these cases is getting sex registration status for life. So, he was 21, so the Oregon statutes are lifelong. California is different, but it doesn't really matter, because once you have lifelong status in another state, there's generally reciprocity. So anyway, and then some people just end up spending hours and hours and hours, 10 hours plus a day in search of sex and romance, just like adults do, just in the same way that adults have the same compulsion to stay online. So here's the rub in sort of what do you say? Do you say that cyber porn is is the new normal, or do you take a position that the downside far outweighs the upside? So that is the message that I convey after having worked with a lot of teens with cyber porn problems, whether you call it addiction or compulsivity or disinhibition. They have such a hard time stopping, and the consequences are so devastating that that my clinical position, not moral, is that it's really a bad idea for them to explore sexuality via the internet. It's a really bad fit between their prefrontal cortex, the sort of evolving judgment that they have, their evolving sense of what's right and wrong, their evolving sexuality, and this very powerful form of stimulation that we call the internet. The refrain that I hear is, I just wish someone had told me how easy it is to get out of control with cyber porn. So a lot of people I work with just said, if someone had told me, it might have made a difference. In a sex education format, but since sex educators stay away from this topic by and large, they don't hear it. So they start to explore and explore. The other population that's very prone to get involved in cyber porn are gamers. So if you have a client that is a big-time gamer, whether they're gaming addicts or not, but when they're spending 5 to 8 hours a day on Saturday and Sunday, and some during the week as well, ending up at somewhere around 25 hours a week, it's extremely unlikely that they're not looking at pornography. So it would truly be a rare exception that a gamer who's at 20 to 25 hours a week is not also looking at porn, and a lot of it. So the risks outweigh the benefits. So I say, that it's not a right or wrong from a moral or religious perspective, although it might be for certain families. That may be the case, but that the damage that's emotional, sexual, and physical and social is what obviously I would be concerned about as a mental health professional that works with a largely pediatric and adolescent practice. It's hard to make an argument that anyone would regret not doing it. It's hard to make a case for that. It would be, you'd miss something, if you didn't do it. So, but you will regret being exposed to child porn, especially the earlier the age of exposure, like kids that are exposed. The average age of exposure is 11, so it sets in motion their entire construction, so to speak, of their arousal template is influenced by cyber porn and cyber porn images and messages. More importantly, it's not even so much the image as it is the message that's being conveyed via the image. Yeah.
What is the percentage of boys to girls?
Well, there's an emerging number of girls that are looking more, but that's really anecdotal. But you read about it, again, it's based on people who work with an adolescent population, but more and more girls are looking at more and more porn, for sure. Yeah.
One of the saddest things I heard was when a young was talking about watching porn to learn what to do.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's the cyber education part of it. Is what do I do? How do I, what is sex about? And then they wander into, a porn site, or they wander into a fetish site, and then get snagged on some fetish that they had never considered, thought about, knew about. No one knew about it. They didn't know about it. Their families didn't know about it, and they get involved in that. So what does that mean to say that it can take over your life? Just like we would with adults. Literally a click here and a click there with the mouse, one can become completely focused on sexual stimulation that these images and videos create. So, and then when masturbation is combined, which obviously mostly it is, with looking at online porn, then pornography provides a very powerful and pleasurable experience. This is, to this audience, an experience to a teen audience that's so pleasurable that many quote unquote regular kids, right, not special education special needs kids, want to have this experience over and over and over through each day. So it happens, it evolves so quickly, the combination, of pornography and masturbation. So the punchline at the top here is that the difficulty with controlling online porn for teens is that it provides an experience of intense sexual pleasure, which we'll get into a little bit in terms of the dopamine rush, that's combined with immediate gratification, so it works really well with their evolving prefrontal cortex, which doesn't want to wait for many things, right? They're still in that evolving period of not waiting for things or struggling as their prefrontal cortex begins to develop and mature. But here's the part that's so enticing, is that pornography can provide a person with whatever sexual experience they want, right? No matter how extreme or strange or forbidden that might be, without having to take into consideration the needs or feelings or values of a sexual romantic partner. So they cut their teeth, so to speak. Their arousal template is created within this framework of I don't need to think about anybody else. I don't need to consider a partner. So in the porn world, right, you can do whatever you want to do, whenever you want it. That's the other part, right, is whenever you want it, with whomever you want, because you can find whatever kind of person you want without having to think of anyone else, without having to, again, pay any consideration to the consequences. So, the fact that most of the women that they're looking at are traumatized, most have sexual abuse histories, most are not there voluntarily in the true sense of a voluntary, of what we would deem as voluntary. They miss the entire sort of underbelly, obviously, of what the porn industry is really about, which is that it's a rotten, terrible industry in terms of the way that women are treated and the way that young men are treated, and they sort of miss that part of it, the moral dimension of what it is that they're viewing, and they're just overstimulated by the images and the videos and the sounds and. So pornography is so powerful as a source of sexual excitement that in teenagers, and this is true of adults too, right, it produces physiological changes in our body, such as an erection, automatically. So just looking at it, there can be an automatic sexual response independent of what the cognition is. So I emphasize that what's really amazing about cyber porn is sexual stimulation even happens when the viewer doesn't like the idea of pornography or feels uncomfortable with pornographic images. So they've seen this in adults with women, where they will show pornography that a woman finds offensive, but they can measure sexual stimulation, and there is sexual stimulation even when the viewer finds the content offensive. So with respect to triggering intense sexual response, our eyes, right, the eyes of the teenager in particular, doesn't see a difference between sex on the screen and sex in real life. They're not making that distinction, and their physiological reaction is not distinguishing between real and not real. And then if they don't have real experiences to compare it to, then this is all that they would know. This is the reality of their sexual experience. I'm working with a 20-year-old who started looking at porn in middle school and has had some sexual experiences, a few, but largely is terrified. That's the other sort of consequence. Is scared to death of having an actual experience with a real person, and has had sort of the porn-induced erectile dysfunction. So when he's with a normal, regular girl, a non-porn female, he isn't aroused, or he's highly anxious at the same time.
I think I read somewhere that that can be reversed at that time. Looking at that porn. Yeah. How do you? You're going to go into this.
Yeah.
What do you
Well, they have. I mean, the first of all, if they're truly addicted, they need some sort of. I mean, I put together a workbook for teens because there wasn't one available. There were so many good ones for adults. Any one of Pat Carnes' books was great. But there wasn't one that a teenager could use. So they need to abstain, first and foremost. They need inner circle, middle circle, outer circle kind of framework, which is Pat Carnes, and also SAA's framework. And the hard part is that they need to start having normative courtship experiences. So they need to be helped to find ways to begin to initiate normative courtship. And Pat Carnes calls this, right, courtship gone awry. That's what sexual addiction is. It's the courtship process that's been hijacked. And now we see it in these much younger. Carnes was writing about adults, right? He wasn't writing about teenagers. But the courtship gone awry is more relevant now to this group than to what Carnes was actually writing about in any of the books that he's written. So I talk about the reason people who view porn become addicted. When you look at pornography in your brain, we do a little brain chemistry here, neurotransmitter education. So we talk about dopamine. Dopamine's released whenever we get sexually aroused. We have high levels of it during porn use. So the porn causes dopamine production to increase dramatically, which means that it feels really good. Right? So whether you like the porn or you don't like the porn, your brain is reacting with a rush of dopamine, or the adolescent brain is flooded with dopamine. So as you know from the adult research, it's like a crack cocaine high. It's a euphoric high, and it produces memories that they can recall. And in SAA, they'll talk a lot about euphoric recall, masturbation. So you get the same thing in teenagers, where when they're not looking at porn, they have vivid memories of porn, then they masturbate to the euphoric recall memories, and then reinforce the whole process now without having to even look at porn, or without having to. They can become deeper and deeper and deeper involved in porn, and their sexual arousal template, what turns them on, becomes more rigid and inflexible and geared towards porn. But it also triggers testosterone, right, which is connected to sexual desire. So there's other feel-good chemicals, as I put them for the teens, adrenaline, endorphin, serotonin. Sometimes there's oxytocin in released as well, which is a social bonding hormone. And so what you get, is not only do they feel good, but interestingly, they feel attached to pornography. So an attachment forms in part just based on the hormones that are released. And Wendy Maltz writes a lot about that in The Porn Trap, about pornography isn't about what the image is. It isn't about how sexually explicit the image or the video is. It's about the relationship of the person to the content. And so if you conceptualize it as a relationship problem, which they get very invested and connected to it by virtue of the neurotransmitters and hormones that are released, as well as the social and psychological sort of bonding that goes on, especially if porn is shared back and forth between partners, between friends, and could be partners, but typically it's just boy-to-boy sharing of porn. So the other part, which has been seen in adults, is that pornography reduces the body's natural ability to produce the same chemicals. So the more porn you watch, the theory is, the less you can produce those same hormones and neurotransmitters on your own in real time in a real sexual experience, which may account for why this there's this generation now, or this emerging group of teens who have erectile dysfunction at 18 years old, or younger. The young man that I'm treating is 20, and he has ED that is clearly porn related. There's no other explanation. I mean, he's healthy, and there's no issues regarding getting an erection, other than that he's watched porn now for 7 straight years. So the more often you are sexually stimulated by online porn, the more often you engage in sexual relationship. That's what I put it italicized. With online media, the more difficult it can be to produce the same chemicals in a romantic and sexual relationship with a real person. So I try to emphasize that it's not bad in some abstract sense. It's destructive in terms of what they really want, which is they want to be in a relationship, whether it is straight, gay, or otherwise. They want to be in a sexual relationship, and this can block and create obstacles to that happening by virtue of the high that's produced. So when you look at cyber porn and then you compare it to other kinds of addiction, it's most like gambling. And as a process addiction, it would make sense that it would be like other process addictions rather than substance-based addictions. But it's a lot like gambling, and because the person, you'll hear this, I'm sure those of you that have worked with cyber porn addicts who are adults will talk about the search. That a big part of what of the process is the search for the right image, or the right video, or the right woman, or the right man, or the right fetish, whatever they're looking for. And so just like landing on a jackpot, right? When they hit it, they really hit it, and then they have this rush of dopamine and serotonin and norepinephrine and adrenaline, and they get high from the right image. And those images get locked in neurochemically. They are burned into the memory system of the teen and the adult, which is why it's so easy for them to masturbate and have euphoric recall, because they can literally conjure the exact video or the exact image. But in this case, they're scrolling and scrolling, looking and looking and looking. And then when they, like with a slot machine, when they pull the lever, sometimes they don't get what they want, right? They don't get the image that they want. So they pull again, right? They click again, and they look some more, and then they click again, they look some more, and then they get what they want. So it follows that it is an intermittent reward system. So it's intermittent reinforcement. The most powerful form, right, of reinforcement is not positive reinforcement. It's not, although negative is very powerful. But in this case, it's intermittent reward. Sometimes they get it, sometimes they don't get it, and that keeps the search going and going and going to get that right image. That's also where some of the collecting comes from, because they want to collect the images that they really like and not lose them and have them at their disposal whenever they want them to be, or have access to them. So I talk about that this is like a jackpot to the teenager. You pull that lever. In this case, it's the mouse or the mouse pad, and they scroll through and get the high that they're looking for, the image or the video. So sometimes you get the winning combination, right? The winning image that keeps the person interested in porn. And so the bottom line message here is that the gambling-like nature of cyber porn combined with the intense sexual stimulation produced by cyber porn doubles its potential for creating addiction. So you have the neurochemical part, and you have this behavioral component part, the intermittent reinforcement, making it a double, sort of doubling down on why it becomes an addiction, or could become an addiction for a teenager. One can go back and forth about, addiction and sex and whether it is an addiction. But in the simplest sense of addiction, when I'm talking to teens and parents, I just use a very simple version of addiction, that there's craving, that there's preoccupation, that there's tolerance, that there's withdrawal. And most parents and kids can wrap their mind around that without getting into a real significant debate about whether it technically meets the criteria for addiction. But they have cravings, they get preoccupied, they become highly agitated when separated from their PCs or their device, whatever they're looking at. They rage, they get very disinhibited and dysregulated, and they develop tolerance. They need more and more of it to get high or to get the same level of sexual stimulation, which is why they get into fetish porn and get into, as a worst case scenario, get into child pornography. Yeah?
Is there a correlation between being dysregulated already as an individual and then seeking out porn?
Well, there's certainly more research on that in terms of social media addiction and video game addiction, just because parents are willing to engage in those kinds of studies. So the four vulnerable populations in teens for sort of internet addiction, in particular where there's been the most research, and gaming, is ADHD and depression, social anxiety disorder, and autism spectrum disorder. So those are the four sort of most vulnerable groups, or most likely to have the most significant problems. And just as an aside, within the autism spectrum population, you get a lot of families saying, well, he doesn't have a girlfriend and he can't get a girlfriend, and therefore it makes sense that he should be looking at cyber pornography. So I say that that's a flawed, a reasonable but flawed assumption that they should be looking at cyber porn since they don't have a girlfriend. That's not actually what they should be doing. It will make life much harder for them, but there is that perception or that belief that it's better than nothing. And then, a lot of that is still based on Playboy, Penthouse, Hustler. I mean, a lot of it is still based on the notion of print pornography, old school. And some of the parents are looking at a lot of porn, but some of them are not and really don't understand what's out there. They don't get it. So I get into this issue of sex education, right? The hidden danger of pornography is the way it functions as a very powerful form of sex education, the way it educates teens. The problem is that the educational messages of pornography are distorted, they're misleading, and in most cases completely wrong, right? They teach the wrong thing about whatever their sexual preference is, whatever their orientation is. It's the wrong message that comes out. So Wendy and Larry Maltz explained the most misleading educational message of pornography is that porn sex is great sex, right? That's what you should be striving for, is what you see in the videos, and that one should strive for casual and largely impersonal sexual encounters. That's one of many messages that undermines their capacity for courtship and for intimacy, is that I need to duplicate what I see in porn. There's a really interesting book called A Billion Wicked Thoughts that's controversial in terms of the science behind it, but it's a really good read, first of all. So it's a really good read. But A Billion Wicked Thoughts. And the upshot of the book was that two computer scientists were able to go into servers, obviously, and take out sex searches on the internet. So the Kinsey study was 17,700 or 300, and this is tens of millions of searches that they could look at. And And so they were able, so they wrote a whole book on what does it mean? Like, what do these tens of millions of searches actually mean? Like, what does it tell us about our evolving sexuality and about sexuality on the internet? And it's interesting because the number one sex sort of search term is teen, and then the other one that is second is for women who are much older. So you have a lot of teen searches, and then you have a lot of people searching for women who are in their 50s, 60s, 70s. So there's sort of this strange juxtaposition chronologically of what is searched on the internet.
You're looking for older?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not milk, it's guilt.
Yeah. Grandmother. Yeah. It's
But grandmothers is like 50, 60 years old.
right. But it's, it's like a 40, 50 year age gap. But teen is the number one search term. But they have an interesting. It's an interesting book. It's well worth owning and reading. It's the largest sample size by far, bar none, of what people look at when they are not. What's powerful about it is it's what people do when they're fully anonymous and invisible. What do people actually look at when they're not being observed? So I get into that no one feels exploited in pornography. Any type of sexual activity is enjoyed by women in the narrative, right, of porn. And that, women are supposed to act like porn stars. And I get into some discussion of objectification, that women are there to please men without needing to be treated in a loving or respectful or tender or romantic manner. That's just simply not part of porn. And in A Billion Wicked Thoughts, when they looked at the searches and they looked at the types of videos, is that the most common woman within a cyber porn video is a woman who has no brain, that literally doesn't speak in the video, or speaks very little, is an automaton, sort of robotic, does whatever is being asked for or demanded for by the male. So women, on the contrary, when they do use porn or get involved in erotic novels, usually have a man that has other virtues, other than sexual virtues, is strong physically, is intellectually strong, is brave. So women have a different composite, even in erotica. They're still looking for men that have actual attributes that we find appealing. And men are looking at women who don't speak or who can't speak. What's that?
That really happens sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So the other part I get into is that cyber porn is the magic pill. It erases negative affective states, depression, loneliness, rejection, depression, anger, the dopamine rush, the testosterone rush. It really is a game changer if you're a depressed and isolated and lonely 17-year-old or 16-year-old or whatever the case may be. So by coming home and tuning into pornographic images, videos, chat rooms, whatever they're doing, a teen can get rid of negative feelings and replace them with a fantasy experience that produces feelings of excitement, pleasure, power, and confidence. So within that world, or that porn world, they have real ability to be strong and competent and sexually, experienced within this fantasy. And then it's easy to forget that what happens online is a fantasy and that their feelings that are created online are part of that fantasy. So it's hard for teens to separate that out and make sense of that. For obvious reasons, they would need someone to help them sort that out. But it is so is video gaming. I mean, it is really an antidepressant, anti-anxiety medication that's powerful and free. So it can be hard to leave the fantasy world, right? If day to day you feel depressed or rejected by peers, especially, or family problems, and so pornography can function like a magic pill. Take one, right? Take one, and you feel better. But obviously, the problem is the more they live in fantasy, and this goes for video games as well, the bigger the problem becomes, and hiding and withdrawing from life only makes life more complicated for them. So it has devastating consequences in terms of their real ability, their real-time ability to cope and deal with rejection and just normal courtship ups and downs. They don't get that experience. So they look like they have cravings like drug addicts, which I mentioned. And that they spend a lot of time thinking about porn when they're offline, and that many can't think about anything else but porn when they're offline. They become truly preoccupied and then become increasingly disinhibited in terms of trying to get back online, compulsive and disinhibited. Yeah.
Do you think the teen that engages in porn expresses themselves more in depression, anxiety, or do they ever become like aggressive, verbally aggressive, agitated?
When they're separated from it, they sure do. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that happens with video gaming as well. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, almost instant. I've said this to other audiences. It's as if they go into withdrawal within seconds of being separated from the technology. Not hours later, not a day later. We would see with substance abuse. It's instantaneous rage. Tantruming, screaming, dysregulated, disinhibited behavior.
Meaning, if you said to the
Yeah.
Tonight at midnight,
Right, you're off.
out forever,
Right.
for a week, you'd say that reaction would start right
At 12:01, right? Yeah.
Or right when they
Yeah.
could be anticipatory that knowing they have to,
They could absolutely, sure. Yeah. I mean, any discussion about it.
even if they haven't
Yeah.
said it.
The other part is that teens, this group of at-risk teens who get into this, lose all interest in their offline relationship with friends and family. They neglect chores, right? This is sort of the common checklist for a problem, with addiction. Chores are neglected, homework is neglected. They drink lots of caffeine drinks to stay up. Their sleep-wake cycle gets inverted. They stay up all night and sleep all day, like the video gamers. That's the biggest problem with gamers and going to school, is that they're up all night gaming and then they can't get up and go to school. And then some teens find themselves concealing their internet activity, obviously lying to parents and friends about what images they view, while feeling guilty and ashamed about it at the same time because they've wandered into some strange territory. And often lie to their peers about what they're looking at. So when I talked to Wendy Maltz about it, she was talking about this part, about this withdrawal symptoms, agitation, depression, sleeplessness, which is identical, right, to the experience of detoxing from drugs and alcohol. So it's extremely similar, except faster. So I talked to them about, imagine this sort of horrible experience, of being sad and angry and anxious and physical symptoms like the flu, and then long period of rehabilitation, to get back to quote unquote normal or to baseline. So I try to impress upon teens that this is really a terrible journey to go down. It's long, it's painful, it's hard to stop, it's hard to reverse. So I don't hold back on saying that this is really, really problematic. And some people just don't like to hear it. You know, they just think, you know, again, porn's the new normal, and kids will be kids, and yeah.
How long do you think it would take a teen, this is a very general question, to get to this point where they're experiencing this type of deep behavior that would mirror alcohol, cocaine? I mean, how long, is this a brain chemistry change, or how, we're talking about trying to get them to stop and a long process to get them
right, heal.
Healthy. How long do you think, would you say, is a reasonable frame of time when they're starting to introduce themselves to porn?
Well,
I
can only say anecdotally, I've had cases where kids were looking and the parents were guessing with it because they had filters and had some surveillance software. You know, as little as 30 days, where they're just completely out of control. And that happens with video gaming as well. Like a kid playing Xbox and within 30 days has stolen $1,500 worth of gaming stuff from the parents via their credit card within just having the gaming system for 30 days.
Do you think the gaming system alone, if porn wasn't involved, can also cause that same effect?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, definitely. So am I really the kind of person who would get addicted to porn? Kids will obviously want to know that question. There are a lot of people that can look at porn sites. They look, they have fun, they move on. So I don't want to, make the case that it's everybody, because it's clearly not. But are you one of these people, or these at-risk groups? This slide is probably one of the more important for teens to think about in terms of who's likely to become addicted to online pornography. Isolation and rejection at school, especially by the opposite sex. Difficulty developing age-appropriate sexual relationships, similar to the first one. Depression, sadness, right? Dark days, pessimism, lack of joy. Teens that experience problems making and keeping friends, especially early in their lives, that struggle from the beginning. And that, as we know, where there's genetic loading, right? Teens that have a lot of genetic loading from their families. For alcoholism, drug addiction, gambling, overeating, shopping, and of course, if there's other people in the family with pornography-related addiction, places them at a higher risk. The problem, obviously, when you're talking to teenagers is that their vulnerability, right, is very much determined by factors that they can't determine until it's too late. They don't really know their genetic vulnerability until they try it, and then they're out of control, and then they know at that point. So if we have a genetic predisposition to addiction based on the family members' problems with addiction, it's possible that one simple exposure to pornographic image could trigger an addiction. That's similar to the alcoholic that says, I had one drink one time and knew that I couldn't stop. So I've heard, again, anecdotally, that kids, looked at porn once and had a profound reaction to it and knew that they would keep looking from the very first time. And then I've talked to a lot of teens who didn't have that reaction. But it can happen that quickly. And then it gets a little dicey when there are teens who have fetish porn and they've then developed a relationship to fetish porn, and you have to be respectful of certain fetishes and understand that not all fetishes are going to be destructive, so you have to sort of really get into the nitty-gritty of what they're looking at. This is just a slide about a 17-year-old that I ended up writing a forensic report for, who sort of slid backwards chronologically and ended up getting arrested. The 12 law enforcement officers were at the house at 10:30 at night and confiscated every computer and put on quite the show for everybody. But they thought somebody in the house was collecting and distributing pornography, so it's understandable that law enforcement would have an interest in it. They were just way off base as to who was actually looking at the porn. Luckily, this particular teen did not get sex registration status and was put on probation and finished the year and was able to move on with his life. So this is just the narrative about the 12 officers coming to the house at 10 and arresting him and then clearing out the entire house, every computer, every tablet, every phone, everything they took everything out. So I'd like to just touch on that with teens. So teens need some guidelines, and sometimes in sex education they get this, and sometimes they don't get it, which is what is quote unquote normal. So I do have a slide on sexually explicit conversations with peers is normal, dirty, raunchy talk, sexual obscenities and jokes if they're in a good-natured manner, flirting, interest in erotica is normal, hugging, obviously holding hands, mutual masturbation. So I go over this slide and spend some time on what is normal, and it can include intercourse with some teens. I'm careful, obviously, to suggest that this is determined in part by family values, but that it's normal if it happens, meaning it's not likely to lead to compulsivity or addiction. And then how do they know that it's sliding in the wrong direction? We have here everything from exhibitionism, right, to aggressive obscenities, sexual graffiti, violating another person's body space, and then they would, under these circumstances, would obviously have a serious problem. So I spend quite a bit of time on these two slides, and we talk about the differences between green light and red light behaviors. So how do you know if you've crossed the line or engaging in dangerous behaviors? Then we spend some time on this. Obscene phone calls, sexually graphic and unwanted text messages, exposing their private parts to strangers, viewing friends or family while undressing, etc. So we go and talk about this in an honest and open way. So if there's kids in the audience that are in this area, they can think about getting some help. Although getting that help is not easy to find if you're a teen. So I end with that they need to get help, whether it's from a parent, a sibling, a relative, a rabbi, a priest, a reverend, and that they can call me as a way of screening for them where they could go. But there's not a lot of places they can go, because the reality is that people don't want to work with teens because they have to work with their parents, and they get into reporting laws, and it's right. I mean, if you're dealing with an 18 or 19-year-old who has these behaviors, then you're in the clear, right? There's no reporting obligation. I mean, unless they're doing something. But if they're looking at child pornography in the house, that means someone might be showing them that, and then you at least have to inquire about making a report. But it's much more complicated to work with teens.
Are you familiar with the organization Fight the New Drug?
I'm not.
And they have a free online module that's anonymous, specifically for teens who are addicted to porn.
That's great. I was unaware of that.
And I wasn't sure how effective it was.
Right. I have not. I just try to get good therapists who will do this and to convince people who work with adults to come over to the dark side and work with teens.
What's the name of that site again? It's called fightthenewdrug.org, and they're an educational presentation, but they've spoke at like the World Health Organization, and they do like they have a national campaign going on. Mm-hmm. But I don't know how effective it is. I don't know much.
Yeah, I mean, some of it is some of what some of it is sort of moralizing and sanctimonious, and but it might be really good.
Their presentation's really secular.
Is that great?
It's focused on the neurobiology, watered down
for teens.
For teens.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's what this is. This is a highly watered down version of a Pat Carnes presentation, or a Wendy Maltz presentation. Is just try to make it, So if you're interested in this, if you go to my website, which is the easiest way to remember it, is just www.teenvideogameaddiction.com, but it has all of this content. Yeah, just teenvideogameaddiction.com, all one word, no uppercase, and there's a video section on that website, and this presentation is there. I had someone actually film it for me, and so I give this presentation, and if you had a client, or you wanted to just learn more about it again, or just sort of review it, because that is on that website. There's actually a lot of video on that website of me talking about gaming addiction, and I mean some of the discussion is already dated because of the evolving landscape of technology, and then this is a good workbook. It relies heavily on Pat Carnes' work. I just changed it and watered it down and tried to make it as interactive as possible. And I'll leave a couple of copies here. But it's inexpensive. It's on lulu.com, lulu.com. And if you just type in my name, Christopher Mulligan, it'll come up. But Lulu really sells them for cheap. They're like $6, $8. I mean, they're really inexpensive. It's How to Recover from Cyber Pornography Addiction, the Teen Cyber Pornography Workbook. So it's inexpensive, it's interactive, they have to write, they have to think, they have to talk, it gives you a template. So it's just like the good workbooks that exist for grown-ups, they just don't exist for teens. So there needed to be something out there. And the phone rings every once in a while now. It was crickets for 3 years, just nothing. No one, every school counselor I talked to, everyone I talked to, we don't have that problem here. We don't have that problem at our school.
How much parental involvement do you expect or want?
I want a lot.
When the teens
Yeah.
are coming with this sort of addiction?
The parents are going to have to play a big part in surveillance if the kid isn't wanting to play. If a kid comes in really wanting treatment, then that would change the way in which the therapy happened. But since since it's in their house and it places them in considerable jeopardy, especially if there's been forays into child porn.
And real quick, do you suggest any prevention techniques for families? Like your upcoming teen, kind of.
Well, like everything else, right, with teens and parents, is that the more honest and open the dialogue is about it, the less likely there will be to have problems, or when they wander into something that is truly frightening and scary and overwhelming, some fetish site or bondage and domination site or some site, and if they can go to a parent, a caregiver, and talk about it, the chances of them going back and re-exploring it go down significantly. So the best filter, is not a filter. The best filter is a caregiver that has an open dialogue about this. With that said, there's something called keylogger software. It's the last thing I'll say. It records every keystroke. So if you have it, it's just called keylogger software, and there's various companies that make it. But what it does do, it's the most intrusive. It is the most invasive of privacy. It records every single keystroke and produces a transcript.
And can parents
Yeah, parents access it whenever they want to take screenshots. But more important than screenshots, more important than filters, is that it records every single keystroke that the teen makes. So if they try to uninstall it, that's recorded. If they try to do an end run around it, that's recorded. Everything is recorded. That's for the teen that really needs tight, parameters to be healthy. It's called keylogger software.
Is that for gaming as well as?
Yeah, you can install it on any PC and Mac and phones, and there's versions of keylogger software. Some kids really need it. They just need that kind of surveillance to be safe.
Just want to thank you for coming, and I really appreciate you coming to present for us.
Yeah, it was real.